Welcome, everybody, to the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. My name is Karen Young, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. We are really excited to have Elena with us. We've been talking about doing this event for some time to launch her book, Eruptions of Popular Anger, The Economics of the Arab Spring and Its Aftermath. I'll introduce Elena. She's going to give a presentation, sort of a formal presentation of the book, because it is wonderfully data heavy, and she has some nice charts. We will be live streaming. We also will have a recorded version of the presentation up on our website probably tomorrow, along with a copy of her slides. So she's generously agreed to share all of that with us. So please welcome Elena Ianchovichina, who is currently in a new role. She's Deputy Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean region at the World Bank. But prior to this appointment, she was for 8 years a lead economist in the Office of the Chief Economist of the MENA region. And she's worked on a wide range of economic issues, including trade, growth, foreign investment, food security, inequality, and political violence. She joined the bank in 2000 as a young professional and has worked in their development research group and the East Asia and Pacific region, and later appointed as economist and senior economist in economic policy and debt. She's written a lot, wonderful publications, and we're going to talk about one of them, if not two, today. And she's born in Bulgaria, which is special to me because I did some of my dissertation research there, and they're some of the finest women economists in the world, I think, are Bulgarians, and has a PhD from Purdue University in Indiana. Let me just frame also a little bit of this the discussion and what I think is so great about this research is that it is data-driven, but it's mixed methodology. And I think that's what makes it so innovative, and I think also very brave to do this kind of work, especially from a World Bank perspective, and to use data from different sources. She's using the Arab Barometer Project, which is a great survey done in the region, as well as Gallup polls, and kind of the standard kind of socioeconomic indicators that we traditionally associate with measures on the region. So there are a lot of questions about how we measure inequality, how we think about it, and this is, I think, a subject for debate afterwards. And also about questions of this special period of time. And coming, my work is about the GCC states, but this period of time before the Arab Spring, the 2003 really to 2011 or 2014 in the decline in oil prices. This was a kind of a magic moment in some ways for the region, this enormous creation of wealth. But we still haven't quite understood how that wealth, especially from the oil exporters, then was shared across the region, and what implications are for this period of time. So I think Elena's work is really important in this regard. Anyway, I'm going to hand the floor to you, Elena. You are welcome to give us your presentation. We'll do a little bit of back and forth, and then we've got a great table of experts, so I hope that we can have questions from all of you as well.
Thank you very much. Does this work?
I think so.
Yeah. So the idea behind this book is to really explore the Arab Spring in a different way. And I recently published a blog in Brookings on the Arab Spring as a black swan event. So an event is a black swan event when it is surprising, impactful, and when it happens with the benefit of hindsight, there are many explanations for why it happened. Often they're not appropriate. So among the many explanations put forward for the Arab Spring, we thought that we need to investigate the economic factors and how they fit into the Arab Spring story and its aftermath, and particularly which factors were the real causes for the Arab Spring. And we thought that this is important because without understanding the real reasons behind these events, it is very hard to design policies that will deal with these root causes and prevent recurrence of protests in these countries, destabilizing them, and also potentially preventing conflict from erupting frequently throughout the region. And we now know that this is still very much relevant. 8 years after the Arab Spring, we see a new wave of protests in countries such as Jordan, but also early in the year we saw a middle-class protests in Iran. So before I begin with presenting some of the evidence that we've put together, I wanted to run by you the key findings. And what we find, and the major really messages are that it's not high poverty rates or high inequality and rising inequality that led to the Arab Spring, but a broken social contract. What we find is that the middle class was getting squeezed, incomes were not growing as fast, or in some cases they were falling, and the middle class was getting unhappy about the quality of life. The standard of living was falling in many countries, especially in the Arab Spring economies. We also have evidence that many people were dissatisfied about the conditions in the labor markets, the shortage of good quality formal sector jobs, and the fact that there was a widespread perception, something like above 80% of the people thought that they needed connections with powerful people in order to do well in life. So the old social contract was malfunctioning, and our emphasis here is to underscore that it was malfunctioning because it had become unsustainable over the years. And the signs were all there to different extents in all the countries in developing Middle East and North Africa. We've seen that the burden, the fiscal burden of general subsidies on energy products and food was crowding out spending on other essential areas such as investments to maintain and improve the quality of education and health services, infrastructure, housing for the disadvantaged. And the private sector was not growing at a high rate enough to absorb the new entrants into the labor force. So while in the beginning, like some 40 years ago, a graduate in this part of the world would find it relatively easy to join the public sector. By the time we hit the 2000s, it was a lot of queuing, and people were waiting for these jobs. Those who couldn't wait were joining the informal sector, and they found out that the conditions in the private informal sector were not good. So there was frustration about unmet expectations. These were young people who were better educated than their parents, and yet when they left school, they found out that they didn't have opportunities that were adequate and that would allow them to succeed in life. So the final finding, which actually came across unexpectedly, but we had a recent report on governance and the law, and it turns out that the social contract is a very critical part of the governance model for security. So a broken social contract or a malfunctioning social contract, along with horizontal disparities in society and polarization along different lines, it could be ethnic lines or religious lines, really increases the risk of civil wars. And so we saw these factors playing out a very important role for the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And we'll look at why some parts of the region were so vulnerable and ultimately really went into civil conflict, which of course pushed millions into poverty and created further spirals of violence which perpetuated and spread throughout the region. So in this book, we look at three puzzles, and this is how we organize it in part one basically tries to find answers to the Arab inequality puzzle. And we do that by investigating thoroughly trends in inequality, looking at new data, putting together new evidence on wealth inequality or economic inequality that we thought is important. And the first hypothesis we had is that, in fact, inequality in the region was underestimated because of missing top incomes. And we find such evidence. We indeed look at that, and I'll show you later for which countries. In the part two, we look at the unhappy development paradox, which is the paradox of declining levels of happiness in countries that have done very well in terms of development progress. And that was puzzling because these are countries where poverty fell. There were major improvements in the access to services such as education and health, yet people were becoming less happy and more dissatisfied. And the third part looks at the paradox of conflict in middle-income Arab countries that do not meet the profile of fragile states. Fragile states are usually poor, they are politically unstable, they sky political risk, and there is a lot of polarization. On the surface, we found that the countries in the Middle East don't meet that profile. So why did the Arab Spring caught the world by surprise? It was clear that most experts considered the Arab developing countries more stable than other developing countries in the world prior to the Arab Spring. If you see here, the green line captures the whole region, and for the GCC, of course, the perception is that the GCC were much more stable, but the same is true for developing MENA. So why this may be the case? In these countries, autocratic governments suppressed voice and instability signs, so they were perceived as more stable. And we see that regardless of income levels, almost everywhere in the Middle East, voice and accountability, the voice and accountability index is lower. Yet at the same time, these countries managed to perform so well in terms of the usual indicators that we monitor progress with. And poverty declined throughout the past 2.5 decades. Absolute poverty was really low in MENA compared to other regions in the world. We had major improvements in access to health and education, with declines in child mortality, declines in maternal mortality. There is evidence, and people have written extensively about these experiences. Income inequality was also low and or moderate, and didn't really increase in many of these places over the past several decades. This is expenditure inequality and puts the Arab countries in perspective vis-a-vis every other country in the world. It's a very extensive database. Yet we have these protests, and this we call the Arab inequality puzzle. The protesters were relatively young. This is the profile of protesters in Tunisia, relatively educated, middle-class urbanites. And if we look at the inequality data for, let's say, Egypt, we indeed find evidence that inequality in Egypt is underestimated in the data. And this is because we correct for missing top incomes at the high end of the distribution using house price data. We find that when we correct for that, the inequality in Egypt is much more aligned with inequality in well-being. If you see on the second chart below, we show inequality in subjective well-being, which in Egypt is at par with Lebanon, which is one of the more unequal countries in the region. Yet, even though we recognize that inequality may have been, the level of inequality may be underestimated. In the countries where the protests started, over the second half of the 2000s, we saw declines in inequality in the countries where the protests started in Tunisia, but also in Egypt. So what was happening, and this is when we do simulations, welfare dynamics with synthetic panels, with a colleague of mine, Hai and Deng, we find that actually the real problem is that there was a squeeze in incomes for the middle class. These incomes grew at lower rates than the incomes of the bottom 40%, or they declined for the relatively well-to-do. And there was a broad-based decline in levels of life satisfaction, particularly for people working for the private sector. And here on this chart below, we show a split between public and private employees, and there is a stark contrast. So people working for the public sector remained relatively satisfied, but those working for the private sector were not happy, and were getting less so. Importantly, if we look at the signs for a malfunctioning social contract, there was a marked increase in the rate of dissatisfaction with public sector services. And this is covering all aspects of it. The availability of affordable housing was a problem. The roads and railways and the infrastructure services, such as the quality of education, the quality of health, and the efforts of government to improve the quality of available jobs. So the breakdown of the social contract led to the so-called unhappy development paradox of increased dissatisfaction at a time when, or even following a period of development progress and major successes. Here, this chart basically shows that actually, even when we look at GDP growth, was not bad. It was moderate to high in the Arab Spring countries, in many of these places, yet there was a decline in the share of people satisfied with their life. So if we look at the relative importance of factors driving this decline in happiness, we find out that there was a major contribution because of dissatisfaction with living standards and labor market conditions, unemployment, and the fact that people couldn't get ahead by working hard. We specifically investigated these questions, and these were the factors that came out significantly in a robust way. Because the social contract was kept in place through coercion, as the economic benefits declined, the premium on freedom increased, and there was impetus for political change and challenging the governments in power. But what happened in the aftermath of the Arab Spring uprisings was a story of moving from failed expectations and dissatisfaction to despair. We saw escalation of rates of suffering, particularly in developing MENA. We see how different the developing parts of the region are from the GCC Gulf-rich states, where the rates of dissatisfaction were much lower. They remain so until today. But in many other places, they skyrocketed because of the civil wars, the fact that many people were impoverished during that period, driven away from their homes, and because in other places which remained stable, we had transitional recessions. And so there was a lot of economic hardship during this turbulent period. And then finally, turning to the paradox of conflict and why some countries went that route rather than remaining stable, we see the importance of the quality of institutions and, importantly, the diversity of institutions of governance. Because the broken social contract was important because it was at the core of the governance model for security. The two pillars of it, the redistributive policies and the law and other institutions, if those two were malfunctioning, then there was a very high risk of conflict in these countries. We see that that was the case in Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and to some extent Syria. These are countries also where, in Syria in particular, there was limited fiscal space. And during the period following the Arab Spring uprising, some countries got financial help, which helped keep populations calm, whereas in other places this kind of infusion didn't come in, and so events turned to worse. An important point is to also understand that country circumstances differ a lot. In countries where there was polarization along different lines, including religious lines, we have a paper now forthcoming in a journal which looks at that particular issue, that external interventions actually intensify the polarization, increasing further the risk of conflict. In the Middle East, and particularly, these horizontal type of disparities overlapped with spatial disparities. In Syria in particular, the drought in the mid-2000s really drove some parts of the population into poverty and hardship, and they happened to be of a certain makeup, ethnic and religious makeup, causing an opening for external players to use this to their advantage. And some takeaway messages. This is more of a long-term goal, but what we learn about the Arab Spring gives us an incentive to think about the elements of a successful social contract. It doesn't look very different from a contract that maybe some of the developed countries already have. Places like Sweden and Norway come to mind, but the emphasis would be on an efficient and smaller government, on a dynamic and growing private sector that would be the main engine of employment and good quality jobs, targeted redistribution that will support the needy and the vulnerable, and institutions that are better quality and work for everyone. So the accountability and inclusion needs to be emphasized, because we know that in countries that are polarized, it could be along different lines. It could be political lines, as we see now in many other parts of the world. Then there is no social cohesion and no will to work towards common goals on the economic front. And so my last point would be that I see countries adopting different paths to go in that direction. I emphasize that it needs to be country-specific, because one of the problems that comes up very clearly from this research, that the old social contract had a very similar shape in all countries, even though they were so different. So this contract may have been stable and sustainable in the Gulf states, where there are a lot of resources per capita coming from oil wealth. But it may not work for Jordan if these rents don't keep coming. And with that, I want to finish, and maybe we can open for questions.
Thank you, Elena. Well, I'll start a little bit just by saying this is a small book, but I think you ask all the big questions in political science and political economy, right? So what do we know about how protest movements, what motivates them and how they spread? What do we know about the relationship between inequality and stability? What do we know about the relationship between wealth and democracy? I mean, all these are huge, huge questions, right? But I think the way that you engage these questions from a multiple sources of data and kind of innovative ones is really important. But I think it still leaves some questions, because how do we best measure inequality? And I think your work, and you touched upon it, but I would love for you to explain a little bit more, especially on the way that you looked in Egypt, for example, on inequality. Because if you just look at kind of some of the measures that we have, things, as you say, we're getting better, right? So why is it, especially in the MENA cases, that it's so hard to kind of, open up the hood of that engine and see really how economies are structured and why mobility is so hard, right? So you said you looked at housing prices, and there's also this issue of kind of the top super rich. We don't really see where their money is. And we also don't really see, why it's so difficult for middle class people to move up, right, in a socioeconomic status. So what methods did you use to try to get at those questions?
Thank you very much. This is really the big question, and it was extremely difficult to get data to look at issues of inequality. We have benefited from work done prior to this project and use data sources, but we felt that the household surveys, they don't have the top end of the distribution, the super rich. And a colleague of mine, Caroline Freund, has written a book about the super rich, and she looks at also the super rich in the MENA region. Surprisingly, the Forbes database on billionaires don't have that many billionaires from the MENA region, and that's sort of counterintuitive. But this is because the Forbes database captures wealth of publicly traded companies. And so we don't have that many that are owned by Arab nationals, but we also understand, and there are some studies done by OECD on the fact that most of the wealth in the region is either in state-owned companies or in privately owned companies by very wealthy families. And this, of course, poses a very big barrier to understanding the concentration. Of course, people who are in the region are aware of the concentration in wealth. We went really at great lengths to also supplement our knowledge on that with the data on wealth in bank accounts in tax havens. And we found that the gap between the MENA region relative to the GDP of this region and the rest of the world has actually shrunk because there is more wealth being kept in such accounts from around the other places. So in terms of that, we also didn't find that wealth inequality is growing. Like there is a lot of concentration, but we don't have a measure of it that is very reliable, and we also didn't find evidence from the data sources that we employed to claim that. And again, the welfare dynamics work shows that it is the issue, and that's why it was important to supplement the work with real objective data with the subjective data, which gives us the perceptions. We discover that the dissatisfaction is actually quite broad-based. It is not only the poor who are unhappy, because the old social contract had a very significant redistributive component in it. And we felt that the redistributive model is expensive, fiscally unsustainable, yet it doesn't provide enough benefits to the middle class for them to feel affluent. And so over time, the benefits had eroded, or the marginal benefit of getting the subsidy. It could be very expensive on the budget, but it doesn't make a family of four living in Cairo feel particularly wealthy. And this is because the main engine of growth for people who are skilled and who are educated would come through good quality jobs or from business that they run, and it grows. And so we find that in this case, there is significant evidence pointing us to the failure of the contract, because the economies of the region were not getting integrated into the global economy successfully. And here I want to mention that in my previous assignments at the World Bank, I've been an economist looking at trade issues for China. Actually, I was evaluating the benefits of China from joining the WTO in the early 2000s. And there is a market difference. So the idea there was that there will be a lot of reforms that will open up opportunities for employment and gradually transform the SOE sector, which was less efficient, into more vibrant, privately driven sector, which will employ more and more people. So their emphasis was on employment generation, and that is not really the case that we see in the Middle East. And the Middle Eastern countries, actually, when I came to the region and started looking, it was just after the financial crisis, we felt that, in fact, these countries were less affected than other emerging markets because they had less links through to the countries that were affected by the financial crisis through trade or finance. And in fact, the GCC countries had more links through the financial channel, right, and they were hit harder, and also because of the oil decline. So these are the reasons why, even though we, actually the first part, we worked really hard on figuring out the inequality part, and we couldn't rule out that inequality is not an issue. Inequality is an issue, and wealth concentration will continue, but the way it is redistributed has to be looked at again to be able to ensure that people accumulate the human capital they need to be successful, and then have the opportunities also to get engaged in the labor market successfully.
So I think also the way you're defining the social contract is interesting, and I would love to hear how you define it, because it seems to me that you're really talking about property rights, you're talking about some protection of against monopolies in industry, some broader access to finance in some ways, right? Protection of assets. But also something that's a little harder to describe, which is that mobility issue, right? Which you could see as rights of workers, or you could see as, any way of, it's not just right of a citizen, right? It's more than that. And so the decay, as the way you describe the redistributive mechanisms of many of the MENA states, is that it doesn't become enough because life is getting more expensive, but also because of it's a lack of productivity. These businesses aren't growing, right?
Yes.
And so how does that connect to a social contract issue? Because does a social contract guarantee that the private sector has some kind of liberty, that it's able to expand? You can't force a family-held company to hire more people. They don't have to, right? So how do you see those concepts being defined and related?
These are really good questions, and so this sheds the light exactly on the issue of rents, and most of these economies can be described as rentier societies, and the rents come from various sources. It could be connections with powerful elites, and that keeps the business profits high. And I do have in the book examples of coming up from the research of my colleagues Bob Rikers and his co-authors, who spend a lot of time working out the differences between Ben Ali connected families and those who didn't have these connections. And these companies had much higher profits relative to the size of the companies than the regular firms. And so if a company can keep up the profits, they don't have the incentives that other private companies have to become innovative, to make hard choices, to compress costs, and to expand markets, to innovate. They are satisfied benefiting from the rents, and they are trying to keep connections with the right people who will be able to keep the policies in place that ensure this protection. So the issues right now in the region are really how much of that is changing, and to what extent these sort of monopolistic type structures are going away, or they're still in place. And unless this is really tackled, there wouldn't be the dynamism that we see. We are going to see companies, and when we look at the profile of firms in the region, they're older, they have been in place for a while, and not much growth is happening in terms of small companies becoming bigger. So it is very hard to incubate and then have a startup grow at high speeds. And we know that these companies are very important for job creation. So the old ones, because they have an optimal size, kept through protection or through connections, they're not hiring as many people. So you don't have these opportunities for employment. And I think this is where we see the connection between the private sector and the social contract. Because the social contract concerns the relations between citizens and governments, what government's role are in terms of supporting the needy. And so there is the redistribution dimension. It has to be stable. And then, of course, protecting the security of citizens in the countries. But it also has this angle on how these governments ensure that the business climate in their economies is such that promotes job creation. Because the state is not anymore an employer of choice. It cannot be. And so employment in the private sector becomes an issue. And you're right that if you have private... Yes, you can, unless you have more new firms entering into this market, you won't have the opportunities for employment. It's a productivity story. It's a story about...
And it's not getting better. Can we say that generally?
Not from what I've seen, and these repeat waves of protests that are, again, broad-based is suggesting that even though temporarily things can be patched up and helped to more redistribution, the original problems remain in many places. And we have a region that's now been really devastated by war. So the question is what sort of contracts we are going to emerge in many of these countries that are going to find peace, and then they start rebuilding.
Right. Well, I'd like to open the floor to all of you. We have Samuel, we have Bill, you can go first. We have a microphone, this one. We'll pass around. Just say your name and introduce yourself, please. Yeah, sorry. I said the name but didn't say where he was.
Bill Lawrence, George Washington University. I'd like to echo all the positive things that Karen said about the report. I really like the way you, not only that you mix sources, but you ask complex questions and give complex answers in a clear way. And that's, I think it's very groundbreaking, particularly for a World Bank report, but not even just as a World Bank report. This is breaking new ground, and I loved it in all those ways that she mentioned. I do have a couple of problems with it, some maybe that come from political science, some from history and causation, right? Some from political culture. And let me ask one of them. In Tunisia, and of course all these cases are different, as you said, although similar in the ways you said. In Tunisia, you had the original self-immolation and then 400 self-immolations across the region. And Hernando de Soto's great study of the 80% of those who had informal sector links, right? And then you had, in many ways, let's say a first wave of revolution that was rural, more male, older, more labor connected, right? And then you had that second wave that pushed it into a revolution of more middle class, younger, male and female, socially networked, right? Sometimes I call it the two Tunisian revolutions, and then sort of the second one sort of half succeeds and the first one still fails, and that's why you still have 8,000 micro-protests here in Tunisia from those same original sources. So I think you've answered really well why and when middle class people and aspirationally middle class people through education revolt. What I'm not satisfied with yet is about the poor side of it, that original, the informal sector, the 30 to 50% of workers in these economies who are poorer and from and with less access to all the things we've been talking about in this conversation, and they're sort of constantly in revolt. So that's my question. How do you marry your findings about the middle class and aspirational middle class with the poor who are sort of constantly micro-protesting?
Let's take two at a time. Mahfouz, why don't you also pose yours?
Thank you for your excellent presentation. Mahfouz Tadros, retired. I'm just wondering how this social contract was developed in many countries. Has there been a real process of engaging with all segments of the society in developing that contract? I know of a country, which is Oman. When we were developing the vision in 1995 for Oman, the World Bank was helping Oman to do that. There was a really very intensive process of consultation, including with the army, with the citizens, with the youth, with the private sector, with the government sector, with everybody. So my question really leads me to the one on Egypt. You mentioned in your presentation that the private sector in Egypt was less favorable than the government sector. Can you tell us, shed some light on why this is the case? I agree with your last point about how to develop a new social contract for many countries. Have some of these countries been following your advice on this? And if so, which countries are doing that? Finally, your comment, which is more elaborate in your paper than what you have done, about household surveys. I mean, it doesn't say much about the household survey, particularly the LSMS surveys that the bank has been doing for many years around. I don't know whether they're still doing it or not. But as a result of the results you got on MENA, and I'm sure in other countries, are you having a serious look at that survey? And are you amending it or revising it or adding new dimensions to it? Thank you very much.
I think I can take these two. Very, very good questions. So on the trigger for the Arab Spring, there were these wave of protests, and including people setting themselves on fire and protesting, actually happened, as you said, with many people. And it was this particular incident in Tunisia that caught people's anger and mobilized activity. And I would say that, yes, the poor are suffering. We saw that in the data clearly. And there is a lot of while absolute poverty is low, poverty at the higher levels of poverty had lines, we measure it as, and we call it vulnerability, is really high. So there is a clustering of people who are just around the national poverty line and who are very vulnerable to falling into poverty. And actually, some of the work of my colleagues in Egypt shows that these people are going in and out of poverty at very high frequency, which is causing tremendous stresses in their daily life. So the book does not, is sort of not focusing on that angle, but we are presenting it to the extent that we have all the quintiles in the distribution, and we saw that this suffering is really at much higher rate among the poor, as we expect this to be. And we are completely consistent with what you said, that this played a big role. And I would say the protests caught the attention of the ruling classes because they become massive once the middle class gets involved. And so that's where our attention was focused, because that's when we have mass revolts and when we had political change in Tunisia and Egypt. But the poor were part of these protests, and we are saying that in a new social contract, the needs of these poor will need to be addressed. This is particularly true for the targeted supports that need to go to the needy and perhaps even increase to address their issues. So the report doesn't really talk extensively about the details of these contracts, but that's where we see things happening. What we are seeing is a huge missed opportunity to use the skills of the middle class that they have acquired through investments in education over many years, and have these people support poverty alleviation so that there is more stability in the social contract, if that is actually happening. We see a really further stretch in the fiscal resources if these contracts remain very untargeted, supporting, so to speak, the supporters of the regimes, which are middle class and educated, But we see that this is not going to continue in a sustainable way, that there would be a time when adjustment will happen. And so the question is, how do countries move towards a more sustainable point? And we see that this is going to be a gradual process because of your other question. I would tie to that. I see, and I'm not an expert on the historical aspects of the social contracts in these countries, but I see them as sort of blending elements of the social contracts in the former communist countries in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, where there was a lot of redistribution, a lot of public sector employment. And so historically, there were a lot of elements borrowed from that. And in the countries in the Middle East, there were substantial resources, natural resources, to sort of not have taxation at high levels financing that kind of contract. But indeed, there is an impression, and some of my colleagues that I have consulted with feel that there was not really broad-based consultations on the merits of these contracts, particularly in places like Syria. If you look at Syria, challenging these contracts occurred even when these contracts appeared stable. And it was basically because of the repression and the fact that parts of the population didn't feel that they had a fair treatment within this contract. So it is more of a interplay between the two prongs of the governance model for security, where we have the sanction and deterrence mechanism working quite well in many places, and we see the prominent role of the military in many of these countries, as well as their economic prowess. So I think in the future, in the countries that have the natural wealth per capita to be able to support these contracts, these issues are less urgent. They still could potentially address them because they are also at the mercy of the markets for oil, and with the price of oil, the intensity with which they view these issues changes. But for the countries that are oil importing countries and the countries that are now destroyed by war, these issues should be of primary importance.
Great. Let's take a couple more. Rachel and Kristen.
Rachel Ziemba. Oh, sorry. Use the microphone. Rachel Ziemba, Center for New American Security. I really enjoyed the presentation and look forward to rereading the report, and the findings particularly, match with some of the work, I did on the Arab Spring, but also did in looking at social policy and the impact of changing contracts in countries like China, where it was in some ways the decline of service quality and uncertainty about service quality and mobility that had more impact on dissatisfaction. So nice to see those results. I'm going to ask a question that I hope is not unfair, but I guess goes beyond the scope of this report, just to wonder what the thinking is at the bank now. I know you've moved on to Latin America, another interesting region around social contracts. But given what you've learned, how would you be thinking, how is the bank thinking about vulnerabilities today? Or I guess maybe my question is, to what extent have there been meaningful improvements? Or are we still looking across, because it strikes me that across many countries in the region, we still have a broken social contract, where there's been some policy learning, especially around targeted redistribution. But are we in an environment where there's still meaningful risks for recurrent waves, or what's the thinking around that? And I recognize this is probably a topic that we will all be spending many, many hours and years working on.
All right, we'll take one more. The gentleman in the blue shirt in the back, and then Kristen. He had his hand up first. He really did. I didn't.
Ted Kattouf, CEO of Amethyst, a nonprofit that works on education throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Given what you've learned in this study, where do you see green shoots, if any? Where do you see anyone learning from what occurred and saying, oh my God, if we don't change, next time it'll be much worse. Not that this wasn't horrible. It was. I mean, Tunisia strikes me as one place that everybody seems to want to pin some hope on, but it's hard to know what reforms are working. And just sort of an add-on to that, it seems to me when the IMF comes into places like Egypt and Jordan, the first thing they want to do is take subsidies away from the middle class and poor, perhaps because they can't touch the elites and the state-owned industries and the corruption and the tax avoidance and the offshoring. So it seems like, do I have that wrong, or is that what's happening?
Those are good questions. Really about competition, right? And the dismantling of the state's fingers into lots of pies. So what do you think about that, Elena?
Yes, I think these are very big questions, and but I will be pretty straightforward and say that I don't know what the World Bank's thinking is on this, and I would prefer to just give you my perspective as a author of this report, which was done under a different management. With different set of people. So, but on the question on what have we learned and, where can we see some signs of hope, I would say that the issues are tough because what we saw in the previous episodes was that when there is a move towards more choices, the choices were limited. And so I think if we can take one lesson is that there is a need to support more in the development of inclusive institutions and organizations where they will mature, and when there is more opportunity for political choices, then the people will be able to have choices to make. And that's why this we found it so interesting that in the countries where polarization had reached really high levels, and we see that Europe is getting polarized, and the politics are becoming more divisive, then the outcomes become more of a black swan thing. You get outcomes that nobody could think of possible. And this is because when the middle class gets split around different groups, it is very hard to work towards a common economic agenda. And in this report, we emphasize that the level playing field should be even for large companies, for smaller companies, for companies of different in different industries, because the problems are hard. They can't be tackled overnight. And this is why you said we have this emphasis on taxation reform or transfers, but not at the big questions. And this is a long-term agenda. It has to be embraced by the policymakers in these countries. They have to stay with it. It is what I've learned from my experience in East Asia is that, and my work on inclusive growth later on, where we had a commission, the Growth Commission, which basically put together the policymakers of successful countries that have grown at rates of 8% or more for 30 years or more. We know that the governments were consistent in their emphasis on pro-growth and inclusive policies. If there is no such emphasis and it goes in and out, that's also problematic. So we see some of these more successful cases in East Asia where there is not necessarily government change through democratic elections, but there is a deliberate will to help the economic prosperity of the country as nations and to enable people to grow wealthier and not to see the private sector as a threat. Mm-hmm. To work with the private sector, but not with selective players who would be supporters of the sitting governments, but to work with everyone and around a common agenda that's not divided.
Kristen, and then we'll go to the back. Can we have the microphone here in the front? Yeah, there you are. Thank you. So the signs of hope?
Yeah, sorry, the signs of hope.
The green shoots. I think she addressed the question of why you go after the subsidies first, but yeah.
Well, the signs of hope, yes, are in countries where there have been consultations. Maybe the signs of hope are not the ones that we hear about. Maybe the signs of hope are hidden, and they're manifested through beginning of consultations with certain groups within countries and bringing them to the table. Having more roundtable discussions, as those happened in many countries in Central Europe after the Berlin Wall fell. And in countries where these consultations were broad-based and there was more inclusion, then there is more buy-in. So it is hard to say, but I'm hopeful that there will be a positive change and it will be gradual.
Okay, thank you. Kristen?
Kristen Diwan, AGSIW. I think actually my questions were sort of largely asked, but let me see if I can just get a different aspect of it. And just what really struck me is when looking again at your recommendations. So when we look at the takeaway towards the new sustainable social contract, I dare to say it looks a lot like probably the World Bank recommends everywhere, and probably what you were recommending before 2011. And I think sort of like Ted Kattouf and others said, and even Rachel kind of hinted at this, I mean, I guess maybe the difficulty then if you're sticking with the same program is really in how do you achieve it, and how do you achieve it without causing even greater instability. Because if you want to look at Jordan right now,
Yeah.
I mean, it came probably through trying to undertake some of these changes that you're talking about. And I'm just wondering then, to the degree you see countries sort of, how committed do you see countries to sticking with the same program, especially if it's, I mean, how do you address that issue that if they're doing it, they're kind of putting themselves to some degree in greater, you know, in
Yes.
the process of it, into greater risk of instability? Or do you see other options? Like, I mean, Jordan right now looking to the Gulf countries to help give them aid so they don't maybe have to take these steps or can take them at a different pace. So I'm just kind of wondering about that and how that plays into in the relationship with other powerful countries that might help them or help them avoid even some of these recommendations.
Yes, that's a great question, if I may
Yeah,
answer
go
it,
ahead.
because
Yeah.
I didn't have the opportunity to talk about the timing of reforms, and I think the timing of reforms is often overlooked or not presented even when we talk about changes to the social contract. It is impossible to act on all these areas at the same time, and often, as our colleague mentioned in a question prior to this one, is that we do the things that can easily be done. And these often involve taking away from some people and giving it to some other people. And so there is a lot of sensitivity around this redistribution of cutting benefits, when in fact, perhaps, the reforms need to be thought through with the angle of keeping stability, if that's the objective. So there are different ways. My answer to your question would be that this is why in my last point I emphasize the country specificity, that countries that are at a very high risk of going in this array, then perhaps it is important to rethink the sequence in which there is a move towards this contract, and work first with the business community, get them on board, talk about what taxes they will pay, the ones that currently have are contributing to the debt base. How can we increase taxes and along with it accountability? How can we do that angle rather than just jumping and doing a very important, from a fiscal adjustment point of view, reform, which, however, will get many people to the streets and create sensitivities and perhaps completely preclude further reform because this one wasn't successful. So giving up too early is one thing that can basically scare everyone and say, well, this is not really working, and maybe we should keep the old model and get more financial help. And that really worked for some time in many parts of the world, but it is very unsustainable. And so this is part of the message, is that the sustainability of the social contract is a very crucial part, because you create expectations in the population as to what they are owed. And especially in countries with natural wealth, if that natural wealth is not managed well, then it creates really frustration. And so that's why we have seen a lot of the conflict occurring in natural wealth countries that are net or have been net oil exporters and are now transitioning into a different status. This applies to both Syria and Yemen. When I worked on Syria in the late 2000s, we had an economy that was flipping between net oil exporting status and net oil importing status. And while there's still resources, oil wealth there, it cannot be like the basis for redistribution. There has to be other sources of wealth to derive taxation. And with taxation, of course, we have the expectation of more accountability. Because in natural resource countries, the so-called natural resource curse literature emphasizes the absence of taxation as one reason why the population does not hold the governments accountable, because they are deriving their resources for redistribution through the oil wealth. But if these countries transition to a model that is based more on taxation and improve accountability with that, over the long run, it cannot be done overnight, but over the long run, they will be in a much better situation to address issues and adjust and create a more sustainable, then it will become clear that the key to the sustainability is a very strong private sector. And the strength of the private sector is something that is a key weakness in all these countries, that the private sector isn't strong.
I'm going to take a couple more questions. I'll take Marcel and then two in the back. But I just wanted to say, we can't divorce a discussion of, economic development paradigms from global politics and what's going on in the rest of the world, right? So, the Asian miracle happened at a certain time and place, because forces allowed it to do so. And, aid patterns shift, certainly were very different in the MENA region when we were during the Cold War. And the last 10 years have been special because there was this enormous amount of wealth created by the Gulf countries in oil exports, and they've deployed that, in terms of their foreign direct investment inside the region. So, the moment now looks a little tricky because the kind of geopolitics are changing. The U.S. role is changing, and especially in terms of the aid relationship. The conflicts are raging. It's going to be very, very expensive to reconstruct in the region. And who will pay for it will have visions for how that money is best spent. So, all these paradigms of, here's the best advice don't exist just, okay, we'll do that, right? It exists within a political context. Anyway, Marcel, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Marcel Wahba, AGSIW. I want to go to your comment about country-specific and how, you stressed the point that each country has to obviously design either its social contract or its reform with that in mind. And I'm really struggling when we look at the MENA Arab Spring countries to come up with any generalization. I find it really difficult. It's always, in my mind, really kind of comparing apples to oranges. When I look at Tunisia and people feel there's a little more hope in Tunisia, well, that's probably because Tunisia is a manageable space in terms of its economy, in terms of its numbers of people. And when you talk about the issue of, not moving too quickly because you have to maintain stability, and stability and security comes first before you can really launch into economic reform, I always think immediately of Egypt, of course. And so my struggle there is, is there hope for countries like Egypt where you have 100 million, a population of 100 million, and if they're always looking at security and stability first, then, where's the road to progress here when you have a population that has huge inequality? Therefore, the government will always be more fearful of the mass demonstration that can bring the country down into chaos. So that very fine balance of how do you get out of this hole and hope to have a more inclusive, a more functional, not only economy, but let's not talk about politics, because I agree with you. I mean, right now we're not talking about democracies. There are a lot of authoritarian countries that do very well on the economic front. So how does a country like Egypt manage to get out of this hole when it always has that fine balance between stability and actually putting together an important reform package that will even begin to answer some of these recommendations?
Yeah, maybe I can turn to that
Please,
question.
it's a
I
big
think
one.
It's a great question, and Egypt is a great example of this trade-off and between stability and also reform. But I think that the key there is probably to focus mostly on the issue of strengthening private sector, but not in a way that necessarily favors some groups, but do it more of the Asian style type of because they do have a large market. They are wonderfully positioned close to big markets, and with the stability, what they gain is perhaps if they make the business climate attractive to foreign companies, they can attract high quality investments that will create jobs, and that's one problem in countries with instability, is that the kind of high quality FDI ceases to go there because there are so many other places better than that market that they can go in. So in Egypt, I see very perhaps signs of hope that they have done some reforms that they have been hard to do prior to that, and moving them in the right direction. And it all depends on, however, on the details of the doing business reforms, because before the Arab Spring, they were perceived as unfair. And there were reforms done to the business environment prior to the Arab Spring, but the perception was that some were favored, the people with connections were benefiting and the rest were not benefiting. So I think a strong private sector that buys into the model of stability with economic growth is one potential model that can work because it has worked in other places. And I see that a possibility for some countries where we will not immediately go to radical change on all fronts. On the geopolitical environment, I think that is really an interesting question, and Piketty and co-authors have written about the inequality across countries, not within countries, which is what we cover in this report, but the fact that the region is highly unequal, with some really poor countries and some of the richest countries in the world being connected together through FDI, through history, through common language. And then, of course, with the price of oil, there are resources to do investments or to have transfers to economies and influence the way these countries make choices, reforms. And that has been actually a source of sometimes stability in countries like Jordan and Morocco, where the transfers have shored up stability. And in some cases, that hasn't been the case. And so there is a need to understand this external environment better to be able to know how things develop. But one thing, and since this report is written so that individual governments can read that report and take messages, is that it is important to be concerned about the stability of your own country. And so policymakers should take that message and do what's best for their own economies, and do the steps necessary to not get swayed in one direction or another if they know that this source of income through rents or through transfers is going to cease, and ultimately it's not going to be a sustainable source of income from their populations. So living on aid is something that many countries have done in Central and Eastern Europe, and it provides a temptation. But ultimately, the source of strength should be self-reliance.
All right, we have a couple in the back. We'll take you and then Omar.
Another perspective on this. you may have covered it in other areas. But has there been much exploration of the role of the diaspora, both in terms of reinvestment into their home countries? Just as examples, take India, for instance. If you take Indian nationals or ethnic Indians abroad, actually about the same level of income and wealth as all of India proper, and for countries like Zimbabwe up to 3 times. So has that been ever considered, or just that affinity from the diaspora?
Great. And Omar Rahman?
Omar Rahman with I'm a researcher here at the Institute. Might be hard to assess with the data. Maybe you came across it in polling data. But is there a perception of the dissatisfaction of living standards, given the counterintuitive economic indicators you mentioned and the unhappiness paradox, with maybe the influence for the perception of living standards outside of the MENA region, given greater access to info, to media, to travel than in past decades? And just a related question, given increasing global economic competition, what are the prospects for MENA countries, especially non-oil exporting ones, to compete globally and raise those living standards to a level satisfactory to their populations in terms of reaching kind of some parity internationally?
These are both great questions. I think on the diaspora, that's a very important question, and there are studies, actually. The World Bank has done a study on the role of the diaspora. So you could actually visit the World Bank's website for more information on that. But currently, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, we had huge movements of people across borders, actually. And I always like to give the example of the initial plan for the Levant. So at the end of the 2000s, there was this quartet, the Levant Quartet, which envisioned greater cooperation on the trade front, and with some permission of movement of business people easily traveling across borders between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan. And even Egypt was considered to join this. And then, of course, all of this went away. People couldn't even believe that this was considered. And now we have massive movements of people, and all other trade has ceased, mostly transforming into trade in basic goods, medicines, things that countries need to replenish destroyed capital. And really, the composition of trade has changed, and of course, the pattern has switched completely. And what has happened, meanwhile, is that, of course, now the support of remittances has become even more important for certain countries where populations have been impoverished. And this, because many of the people are still located in the region, the majority of refugees still the residents of neighboring countries, including Lebanon and Jordan. So it is vital for people to be able to send support to their families remaining in Syria. And this has been addressed through basically reforms that enable Syrians to work in Lebanon and Jordan. Of course, there are many who work in the Gulf states, and unfortunately, some of the events have implied that many Jordanians who work in the Gulf have returned because of the issues. First, initially with the fall in oil prices, there was some of that decline, and certainly tourism has declined substantially, meaning that there is a lot less of that going to countries that previously were creating a lot of jobs in tourism. Now, on the role of the media, and certainly the expectation formation is influenced tremendously these days by what's happening around the world. So people no longer view their neighbors as the benchmark. They actually see how people live, and people with similar education, similar backgrounds, and how much better off they are if they're in a different country. So the media certainly has formed these expectations, and it is really how we explain this perhaps overly optimistic expectations of how things would turn out by the end of the 2000s. And the disappointment is larger because the expectations were higher. And so this media exposure certainly is influencing developments today. It is also many writers are writing about the way the media is now channeling views and splintering the voting blocs in many countries. And so it depends who you follow these days to perceive the world in one way, and if you follow someone else, you perceive it differently. So there is also a lot of that, and much of it is not really understood, and it's an area of potentially future research. It will be increasingly difficult for the oil poor or the non-oil rich countries to create viable sources of employment given where they're starting and the fact that they missed the first wave of globalization and the fact that now, as we see, there's tremendous anxiety about employment creation everywhere in the world. So there is the new system is sort of getting stressed, and the global system of trade and investment, there will be investment implications. And so for countries, that is why it is even more important they look at improving the business environment, the conditions for domestic private sector firms to operate, because that's where you start. If you know that things are changing, then the things that policymakers can influence are those that are in their domestic markets. They cannot rely on the stability in the global environment that we had in the 2000s or the prior years. Now we shall see how how countries will have to go back to revisit what is their comparative advantage. How are they going to deploy their human resources? What sort of opportunities they have to offer in their domestic economy so that their people get trained and get the skills. One interesting paper actually explores why there is a gender gap, for example, even when men and women in the United States do the same job, working for Uber. And one area which explains the gap is that not discrimination, but lack of experience. So if you have a lot of trained people underemployed or unemployed or waiting for jobs and not gaining the experience, this human capital erodes and therefore makes these people a lot less able to be productive once they get jobs, and they're behind in a competitive sense. So I think that's why the Middle East now has a private sector first agenda, in my view.
I think we'll close it down now. I really thank you, Elena, for this wide-ranging conversation. It's hard when you ask the big questions. You don't necessarily get easy answers, but I applaud you for making the effort and asking these tough questions, and congratulate you on your work of that and your colleagues. I think this will be an important book that we'll all be referring to for a long time, so congratulations. Thank you.